Who you seek is seeking you. I once was lost, but now am found. I was blind, but now I see. I can't count how many times I've sung these famous lines, and you probably can't either, from John Newton's Amazing Grace. And it was Amazing Grace that in last week's epistle, the slave Onesimus experienced this kind of loving grace from his owner, Philemon. I still find these songs and this song's assured language moving and beautiful, even though I've known Amazing Grace for a very long time. But here's the thing. I'm not so sure, or I guess I would say I'm not so convinced anymore that I can fit my faith into its neat before and after story. Why? Because my lostness isn't over. Lostness remains a central feature of my relationship with God, and if this week's reading has anything to say about it, this is exactly the way it should be. The lost lamb in the first parable belongs to the shepherd's flock from the very beginning of the story. It is his lamb. Likewise, the coin in the second parable belongs to the woman before she loses it. The coin is one of her own, one of her very own. In other words, these parable stories are not about lost outsiders finding salvation and becoming Christians. These parables are about us, the insiders, the churchgoers, the bread and wine consumers, the Bible readers. These parables about lostness are on the inside. Well, what does this mean? It means that lostness isn't an experience exclusive to the non or not yet Christians. Lostness happens to God's people. It happens within the beloved community. It's not that we cross over once and for all from a sinful lostness to a righteous foundness. We get lost over and over again, and God finds us over and over again. It's part and parcel of the life of faith. But what does it mean to be lost? I think it means many things. Think for a moment about the ways you've wandered without even realizing it, the ways you've lost your moorings, your footings, and found yourself in strange, frightening lands with no markers to guide you home. Sometimes we lose our sense of belonging. We lose our capacity to trust. We lose our felt experience of God's presence. We lose our will to persevere, and we lose our capacity to discern right from wrong. Some of us get lost when illness descends on our lives and God's goodness starts to look not so good. And some of us get lost when death comes to a loved one without even a warning, and we experience a crisis of faith that leaves us reeling. And some of us get lost when our marriages fall apart. Some of us get lost when kids break our hearts. Some of us get lost in the throes of addiction or anxiety, lust, unforgiveness, hatred, apathy, bitterness. And some of us get lost very close to home, within the very walls of the church. We get lost when our prayers turn to dust in our mouth, when the scriptures we once loved just seem to be dead on the page, when sitting in a pew on Sunday morning just makes us uncomfortable, when even the most well-intentioned sermon sucks the oxygen out of our lungs, when the table of bread and wine that once nourished us now leaves us hungry and cranky and bewildered and bored. We get lost. All of us get lost. So how do we get found? That's what makes the gospel the good news. And that's what we need to talk about. How do we get found? Some of the fastest growing churches in America these days are the self-styled seeker-sensitive churches. That is, they attempt to reach unchurched people, gradually drawing them into a relationship with God through contemporary music, drama, video sketches, and sermons, that are crafted to meet common human needs. It is typical for these newer churches to exchange traditional for contemporary Christian music and take away all the overt reminders of traditional churches. Casual dress, not vestments, is acceptable for leadership, and they will use whatever means possible short of compromising Christian faith to reach those people who are maybe repelled by or who have dropped out of traditional churches. Seeker-sensitive churches are simply trying to put themselves in the shoes of the person who maybe wants to know more about God. Indeed, many of these churches are opening a new door through which some people are finding their way back to God or into God's family for the very first time. Whatever you might think of the revolving door methodology, can we at least celebrate that some who were lost have been found for God? For a long time, I thought that the lost lamb and the lost coin represented the unchurched and the unbelieving, the people out there, the atheists and the naysayers, those folks beyond the fold, beyond the home country I call Christianity. But no, the lost lamb in the very first parable belongs to the shepherd's flock from the very beginning of the story. It is his lamb. And likewise in that second one, she owned that coin. It was her very own. In other words, these parables are not about those people out there. It's about the people inside. The churchgoers, us. Well, what does it mean when lostness happens to God's people? The gospel lesson today seems to applaud such a focus on a person who is lost from God. So Jesus tells those three cute little stories. Well, the third one isn't small. A sheep, a coin, and a son. We all know the son story. Why these stories? The context makes it plain that some of our current religious leaders, the current religious leaders of Jesus' day, mercilessly faulted him for his extension of mercy to those outcasts from the traditional religious institution of his day. And he used the occasion to tell us all something very important about the heart of God. First, God wants the church to be a place where people who are lost from God can find their way back home to him. The church is supposed to be a lighthouse, a hospital for broken souls, not a museum of perfect saints. The church is not a safe to be cracked. It's not a fraternity or sorority to be pledged or rushed. It's not a castle to be stormed. Sinners are drawn to Jesus, but some of them have so much difficulty feeling drawn to his church. Why is this? Could it be that we have turned so much of our attention onto the people who are always there, that we can always count on, that we've only paid attention to the insiders instead of some of the outsiders? Could it be that there is a world of prodigal sons and daughters who have experienced us as that older brother with that judgmental scowl of the older sibling in the prodigal son story? Lostness happens to God's people, like it or not. It happens within the beloved community. It is not that we cross over once and for all from sinfulness to righteousness and fondness. We get over and over and over lost, and God finds us if we are willing. But what does it mean? Think for a moment about the ways you've wandered without realizing it, the way you've lost your moorings, your security, and found yourself somewhere else. Maybe doing the church hopping kind of thing. Maybe you've lost your sense of belonging and the capacity to trust anybody. And we lose our felt experience of God's presence along the way. And we lose our will to persevere. We lose the capacity sometimes to discern right from wrong. And some of us, we did. Like I said, illness came, death came, marriage fell apart, kids broke our hearts. And maybe even now, some of us are in addiction or anxiety or lust or unforgiveness or apathy or hate or bitterness. These are things that take us away from God. Read those parables again. God is full of grief when even one of his children are lost. And he is willing to turn the world upside down to get that person to be right side up. So how do we get over this scandalous grace that God offers? Well, we accept it. We remember that every one of us, every first and last one of us is equally forgiven, equally welcomed by God, equally undeserving. We are undeserving of his favor. There is plenty of love in God's heart to go around for all. But here's the other truth Jesus taught us about God. God is the great seeker. If there is one small critique to the seeker movement in the contemporary church, it would be the mistaken notion that it is humans who seek God, that we are the seekers. In fact, as our lesson from both the gospel and the epistle show, it is God who does the seeking. Before anyone thinks about God, God has first been thinking about them. Before any of us seeks or finds God, it is God who is seeking to find us. All this is the best news of all. For if it's the game of spiritual hide and seek, if it was only up to us, we would never be found. And God would never be found. God, the searcher, the seeker, the determined, is the Hound of Heaven who finds us. If Jesus' parables are true, then God doesn't hang out where I assume God does. If Jesus' parables are true, then God isn't in the fold with the 99 insiders. God isn't curled up on the couch polishing the 9 coins that she's already sure of. God is where the lost things are. God is where lostness reigns. God is in the darkness of the wilderness. God is in the remotest corners of the house. God is where the search is at its fiercest. Meaning, if I want to find God, I have to seek the lost. I have to get lost. I have to leave the safety of the inside and venture out. And I have to recognize my own lostness and consent to be found. This isn't easy for most of us. It's hard. It's hard for us to believe that we're worth looking for. Fortunately, the grace of God is first seen in the face and fact that while we were still clueless of God, he was already seeking us with love, leaving clues to help us find our way back to him, clearing the way for our eventual return home. And so, as the Apostle Paul rejoiced that even though he was chief of all sinners, God sought and found him. We are not the primary seekers after God. God is the great seeker after humans. As Jesus said in his own ministry, the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. Seek and save the lost. Luke 19, verse 10. Jesus tells these parables to religious insiders who won't admit to their own lostness. He shares these stories with folks who can't reconcile their brand of piety with Jesus's bewildering claim that lostness has its virtues. In her beautiful book, Barbara Brown Taylor, An Altar in the World, she makes a strong case for these virtues, and she argues that lostness makes us stronger at the edges and softer in the center. Lostness teaches us about vulnerability, about humility, about patience. Lostness shows us who we really are and who God really is. In the 13th century Sufi mystic Rumi said, "You know, what you seek is seeking you." Well, I don't think there's anything more true. All those years ago, Rumi knew that from the Sufi mystics. God looks for us when our lostness is so confusing and so profound and can't even pretend that we're looking for God. But even in that bleak and hopeless place, God finds us. And this is amazing grace. And it is ours for the taking. So anyone feeling lost today? Well, God has a good word for you, and here it is. Ready or not, here I come. Isn't it time for you to be found? And the people said, Amen.